Welcome to Module 3. Since recorded history, people have had a conception of the divine. In fact, the philosophical method of inquiry in no small way was born out of a response to the tradition of attributing reality to God. However, there came a tension between philosophy and religion that still exists today. This tension escalated after the Renaissance when scientists began to rely upon naturalism as a means to explain truth and reality. And yet, there is still philosophical inquiry motivated by religious concern. The search for truth is often tied to questions about the divine and our relation to it. Some have argued that there is no God, while others give convincing arguments for the existence of God. The traditional concept of a single God is anthropomorphic. That is, we describe God in terms of our own attributes. Three major attributes are omnipotent, that is all-powerful; omniscient, that is all-knowing; and omnipresent, that is, God is present everywhere, all the time. However, this single God concept is the concept accepted by the Jews, Christians, and even Islam. In history, the Romans, Greeks, the Norsemen, and even many tribal communities today believe in multiple gods and goddesses. Monotheism is the belief in one God. Polytheism is the belief in multiple gods. Do you believe? In this module, you will learn that there are different types and varying degrees of belief in God. Three such beliefs are as follows: the atheist, the belief of no God; the deist, this belief says that God created the world, but he has no personal interest in it or with humans; the theist believes that God definitely exists. Then you will talk about the problem of evil and how there could be a good God. If God is good and loving, why does he allow evil and suffering? This very question is at the root of many arguments against Christianity. There is no one question that will satisfy all critics, but several key ideas may be considered to address this from all angles. Good versus evil. If someone believes in the existence of evil, then that person must also believe in good. Without goodness, there would be no distinction between good and evil. If one believes in goodness, then, he must also believe in some moral code that defines this goodness. However, if a moral code exists, there must be a source of that moral code. This source is God. The very argument against God, then, can be used to show that a higher moral source, or God, must logically exist. Then there's the free will defense. The question is not really whether God caused evil and suffering. This issue is more that evil is not of God. Norman Geisler explained in his book, When Skeptics Ask, that God is indeed the author of everything in his belief. Many mistakenly believe, though, that evil is a thing. They believe God created or allowed evil in the world. But he argues that evil is not a created object. Evil is a deficit, a lacking in something. Evil could be likened to a parasite that could not exist alone, but only as a hole in something that should be solid. Geisler states that evil arose from free will. If God did indeed create all things perfect, then this creation must have included mankind with a free will. If mankind did not have free will, then he would have been a slave, and slavery is not a perfect creation. The notion is that God created mankind with a free will which made evil possible. Only mankind's act of freedom to make wrong choices made evil become actual. Evil and suffering are a direct result of wrong choices brought about by the willful choice to disobey God and His moral code. Perhaps neither faith nor philosophy can be truly successful without the other. Religion has inspired some of the best art and the most fascinating philosophy in history. This module is devoted to understanding the link and the tension between faith and philosophy. You will study the question of evil in the world, which some proclaim is why God cannot exist. However, this will be followed by traditional arguments for the existence of God. All in all, you will be challenged to develop reasons, statements, for believing the way that you do. Hollywood producers have recently shared viewpoints on God's existence through several movies. The 2014 film titled God's Not Dead featured a philosophy professor who professed atheism. The professor informed each student that he or she needed to write down on a piece of paper that God is dead. One student, a believer, however, objected. So the movie's premise is how the professor and the student were at odds as the student tried to convince his classmates that there was at least a possibility that God is not dead. The student wanted each classmate to be able to make his or her own opinion instead of merely accepting their professor's viewpoint. In the end, the professor proclaimed he was mad at God. That's why he was an atheist. However, the student pointed out that a person cannot be mad at someone who doesn't exist. The professor had just disproven his own atheist viewpoint. This is why it's so important to know not only what you believe, but to be able to articulate the reasons why you believe as you do. 2 new movies are recently out. One is called Miracles from Heaven, released March 2016. It's based on the true story of a young girl who fell from a tree and was healed from a grave health condition. The doctors just could not explain it. And then there is a God's Not Dead Part 2 to be released on April 1st, 2016. It might be time for a movie trip. Before I leave, here are some points that will be raised in the textbook. First, there is Pascal's wager. Blaise Pascal was a French philosopher, a mathematician, and a scientist. But he argued that belief in God is the safest bet, all things considered. If God exists and you believe, it's infinitely good. If God exists but you don't believe, that's infinitely bad. If God does not exist, then it's about even. Second, there is Voltaire. He was a leading philosopher of the French Enlightenment who provided a deistic notion that God is necessary for the formation of the first laws of physics. Voltaire stated if there were no God, it would be necessary to invent him. Then there's Thomas Jefferson, our 3rd American president. He was also a deist. He believed that God existed because of his belief in the principles of physics.